Hello, everyone. Welcome to our series. Our team is grateful you're here. Of course, seeing you in person would be preferable, but given the ongoing response to managing the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic at Hopkins in our local communities, these virtual platforms have proven to be an efficient means for sharing information, education, and discussion. A couple of updates. So next month will be our last session of this winter-spring semester. On Monday, May 9th, two of our clinical leaders, medical oncologist Dr. Noah Hahn and urologist Dr. Max Cates, will be joining us for a discussion around their unique perspective in caring for patients and families in a multidisciplinary setting. Please do bring your questions. Also, please keep connected. You can find our updated programming and a new newsletter on the web. Just Google Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. And I wanted to again draw your attention to our evolving group of programs specifically tailored around the experiences of women with bladder cancer, developed and led by Drs. Armin Smith and Jeannie Hoffman-Sensis, and the program team of Pamela Getz, Samantha Rockler, and Stephanie Cooper Greenberg. Their June program will feature special guest Dr. Elizabeth Platts for a discussion around population science and cancer survivorship. Again, all of these are up on our site, and if we can help you directly, we are only an email away at bladdercancer@jhmi.edu. Grateful to you all for joining us today for a conversation about what we know related to potential environmental exposures in bladder cancer. I hope you will allow me the chance to provide a brief introduction of our speaker. Dr. Sunil Patel is an instructor of urology here at the Brady Urological Institute. Dr. Patel attended Boston University for medical school, did a urology residency at the University of California, San Diego, and completed his urologic oncology fellowship here at Hopkins. Dr. Patel has also dedicated countless hours to studying and publishing on the role of urology and environmental stewardship, health disparities among patients receiving care for bladder cancer and kidney cancer, and how the novel transperineal biopsy can be used to more effectively diagnose prostate cancer. I'm grateful for his willingness to come to our session and share his experience with us. Dr. Patel, welcome and thank you for joining us today. He's agreed to speak for 15 to 30 minutes, and then we will go to a larger group discussion. And I would ask for folks to bring their questions into the chat or the Q&A, and after our conversation, we'll have ample time for group discussion. Sunil, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. McConkey, and thank you everyone for joining this presentation. Like Dr. McConkey said, we're going to briefly talk about a little bit about cancer and kind of, is it all around us? And so I'm going to take the next kind of 10 to 15 minutes or so, kind of talking a little bit about a background in terms of this topic, and we're going to have a kind of in-depth Q&A following this topic. And so really the goals of this is really to understand microplastics, BPAs, PFAS, and our exposure to it, to understand potential associations of plastic and other environmental toxins in urological oncology, specifically bladder cancer, and then really understand that there are vast limitations in our knowledge in this space, which is actually makes this whole topic very interesting and kind of an area where I'm going to really kind of devote my entire research career into. And I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest to disclose. So briefly, this kind of topic, and I guess my interest in this as well, potentially maybe a lot of interest to you as well and others, is really stemmed from this very powerful image from the National Geographic cover on June 2018 with a plastic bag mimicked as an iceberg, and really talking in this kind of debate about planet or plastic. And really this key article and series really highlighted the amount of plastic that we are utilizing and using and kind of dumping in our planet, in our oceans. And this image is quite powerful because it kind of shows how we've only began to understand the tip of the iceberg. And there's a vast amount of stuff that we don't know, and a vast amount of garbage and waste that we're producing that we really don't and cannot fathom. And we're seeing these kind of stories kind of come through the news, such as all these kind of topics. Firefighters are seeing forever chemicals in gear, which is related to PFAS. Gears that we're using in kind of everyday household items can be toxic to us. And we're finding new and new things such as microplastics found in our human blood and organs. And this is an area of kind of distraught for some people. And it's also an area of high uncertainty for all of us, especially for people like myself who are very interested in this, not from an environmental standpoint, but also from a health standpoint, being a urologic oncologist. And so when you're thinking about all of this, really is the so what. We all know that plastic consumption and at least high volumes of waste, and not only is there the space occupying issues of all of our consumption, and as this image is really powerful, it just shows the vast amount of bottles and plastic bottles that we're using, but really we want to know the health consequences of it. And really this kind of ties into kind of plastic and what the components are and how they're degraded. And if you look at microplastics, so microplastics are defined as plastic particles smaller than 5 millimeters. And we're finding more and more reports of microplastics in food, particularly seafood and sea salt, and also drinking water. And newer studies are really showing that we're seeing microplastics within our tissue. And plastic particles are seen as foreign objects and foreign bodies with kind of, this is going to extrapolate to larger foreign objects placed in humans, and which may trigger local immunoreactions. And so we really don't know what microplastics are causing. However, we're finding them in our bodies, and we're finding them in more and more spaces. And to highlight one quick study is the study, this group of investigators looked at microplastics, and they looked for the presence of them in human feces, and they looked at these participants, again, a very small study. However, they looked at their exposures to plastic bottles, fizzy drinks, and meals containing kind of plastic wrapped food. So very common items that we would encounter on a daily basis. And we're seeing that they're finding these microplastics in our human feces and the different kind of components of them. So it's one to kind of start questioning, is there something here to this? Another study really looked at 47 samples, and they looked at actual tissue samples. And these were obtained from a tissue bank, and they found microplastics were found in all samples, with BPA, which is bisphenol A, which we'll go into in a little bit, was seen in all the components. None of these patients or these tissue banks, or from what we were told, actually had cancer, but again, we're just finding them in human tissue. So again, we don't know the detriment or if there are any detriments. In kind of shifting forward and looking a little bit more into the BPAs, there's some loose associations and some data. So components of plastic, such as phthalates, which DHP, PVC, which is very common, and BPA, bisphenol A. There's some early studies showing that there's a potential carcinogen effect to it, as well as they may serve as an endocrine disruptor. And some of these, namely BPA, have been linked to hepatocellular, which is liver, breast cancer, and as well as others, namely stomach cancers. Again, these are there's very limited data. However, we're starting to understand that there potentially are effects in the human physiology from these components. And briefly, BPA is a synthetic monomer used to the lining of many goods, such as cans and water bottles, and it gives plastic bottles the plasticity, or the ability to be malleable. And we know that it is a very strong estrogen receptor. And if you look at BPA, BPA gained its kind of, I guess, spotlight in the late 2000s, early in late 2000s, and we were noticing that we were using BPA in a lot of bottles, and that's when the EPA and the FDA put us at a regulatory notice on it. And if you're looking at the exposure to BPA, in the US alone, 90% of the population is exposed to BPA, making it one of the most common plastic derivatives which we are exposed to. PFAS, again, another common item that we are exposed to. It's polyfluoroalkyl substance, and it's been deemed the forever chemical, and that's because its half-life is pretty significant. It takes around 1,000 years to break down in nature. And again, it's very common. We see it in a lot of food packaging, such as the lining of microwave popcorn bags, wrappers, outdoor gear. So a lot of our winter gear or rain gear potentially can be coated with it. Cookware, some of our furniture, but again, which has been kind of coming out more so in the news, are firefighter gear and fire retardant repellent. In early studies, which has been recently just coming out, led to this kind of statement, which was in 2017, they labeled PFAS as a potential human carcinogen, which again, it was based on a very small epidemiologic evidence, and they said there was some evidence of an association with kidney cancers as well as testis cancer in subjects that have high exposure to them. And given all of these, the team here, including myself, Dr. Metcalf, Dr. Biblock, and Dr. Cates, we wanted to really see, was there anything out there in the field of urologic oncology and urologic malignancies, given that PFAS kind of statement that was put out by the National Cancer Institute and the FDA and the EPA. And we did a very thorough search, and we looked, and really essentially the big conclusion we found was that there are some associations, but there's very little data that can link them or show that there is actually a causative issue. And if you look at urologic oncology, looking at prostate cancer specifically too, there was only really one study in there that had some high number compared to the others, and it was 60 patients with prostate cancer. And they looked at the urinary BPA concentrations in men with prostate cancer with men without prostate cancer. And what they found that even though the PSA levels were roughly similar, patients with prostate cancer had higher levels of BPA in their urine than patients who did not. Again, we don't know if that was a causative relationship or just happened to be found. And again, the issue with BPA and urine concentrations is we really don't know the time-specific exposure. Did these men drink out of water bottles right before their urine was collected? Did they have a slightly higher risk? We don't know how long they were exposed to BPA. And so there's a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty that comes to in terms of environmental exposures and linking them directly to cancers. And this is a study that we did here, led by myself and Dr. Cates, as well as one of our excellent PhDs, chemist, Dr. Carson Prassi. And very similarly, we wanted to see, was this associated with bladder cancer? And given that bladder cancers and testis cancers are historically been tumors that we know have high exposure or caused by environmental exposures such as tobacco and other environmental toxins, we wanted to investigate this. And so we did a study looking at urine samples from 20 patients with known bladder cancer, 20 patients with known prostate cancer, and 20 patients who were served as controls who had no known cancers. And teaming up with a PhD chemist in their lab, we looked at the samples and we did use mass spectrometry to identify and look at did a quantitative analysis. And we found that there were elevated urine BPAs in all of our, all patients had BPA in their urine. However, we find much higher levels in bladder cancer cohort compared to the prostate cancer or the controls. Again, we don't know anything about if this is a causative issue or not, or just something that we happen to find. And so if you really look at kind of what we know so far, it's very limited. And really what this boils down to is that we really need to dig in deeper and do a very comprehensive investigation of BPAs, PFAS, and other toxins, and study them in urologic malignancies. We're noticing this more and more and more. And we know that we live in this modern society where we're seeing plastic and other toxins and other kind of artificial things around us all the time. And that's something we can't really get away from right now. And I could chat a little bit about how to avoid that, but we're in this kind of environment, in this kind of modern day and age where it's around. And so we really need to see if there are any consequences or not. And again, we really need to discern, are there any associations with these toxins causing cancers? And again, there's a lot of limitations. We don't know exposures, concentrations of all of these kind of toxins. And that's something that's going to be difficult, but that's something that's very exciting as well to understand. And then the last kind of follow-up is, what can we really do right now? And I think the best thing something that I tell all my patients as well, as a urologic oncologist, is we can do a lot of things to avoid most of our risk and avoid known carcinogens. So arsenic has been well studied, but smoking is a very big thing that we can limit our exposure to, whether that's chewless tobacco, whether that's smoking, whether it's secondhand inhalation. Those are all, we know that there's a high risk for bladder and exposure to bladder association, with bladder cancers. We know that heart healthy diets as well can help, and those are linked directly with diabetes and obesity. And we know that we don't know the exact mechanism. However, there's been a lot of studies associating with obesity and cancers in urology, really with kidney cancers. And the hypothesis is diabetics and obese people tend to have this higher state of constant inflammation. It can disrupt your endocrine as well as your hormonal levels, and increase your estrogen levels, especially in men and in women as well, and disrupt the whole balance. And then there also can put patients in a state of excess free radicals, which can cause cellular damage. But then from an environmental standpoint, in our need for plastic, we can always limit our need and our utilization of plastic and our dependence on plastic. And that is being very conscientious of reusing plastic so that we decrease it's all the whole thing about supply and demand. And if we can decrease that, we can decrease our constant exposure to plastics as well. With that, I want to open up to Q&As so we can really dive in a little bit deeper.
Thanks a lot, Sunil. So a lot of people don't know this, but I actually received my PhD in biochemical toxicology. And one of the things that I did as a new graduate student was I studied the toxic effects of dioxins. So I am super excited that you've decided to be interested in this and that you want to devote your career to research on the effects of these agents on risk of bladder cancer. So we've got questions flooding in, which is great. But maybe before I start answering them, I can just kind of clarify. You said something during your talk about endocrine disruptors. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about what those are exactly, because I think it's an important kind of general concept.
Yeah. So endocrine disruptors are toxins or agents that disrupt our hormonal balance. And BPA is one of the most kind of well-known ones. And if you're looking at the issues and some of the hypotheses we see, especially what's been alluded to, at least in prostate cancer, and we can talk a little bit about bladder cancer as well, as BPA stimulates the estrogen receptor. And what that does is it could potentially disrupt the normal balance. And prostate cancer, as we know, the fuel for prostate cancer is actually androgens as well as testosterone and DHT, really. And so when we're combating prostate cancer, especially a gentleman with metastatic prostate cancer, we give them essentially a hormonal blockade. And if we disrupt that, we can potentially disrupt our ability of our medications to help patients with prostate cancer. And so that's another concern, especially at least with BPAs. In bladder cancer, that we still don't know exactly how hormonal or estrogen function really affects it. Men are seems like more men than women get bladder cancer. However, we do see a lot of fair share of women getting bladder cancers. However, we still haven't completely understood the association of how estrogen and that receptor plays a role in bladder cancer. And I think there's a very kind of mixed data, or there are mixed data in there. And I know, Dr. McConkey, you probably know this more than I do. However, again, it's very unclear if it's protective, if estrogen is protective or not protective in bladder cancer. So that's another kind of big kind of area that we really don't know much. And I think that's again another big area that we really need to research.
Yeah, everyone I think is familiar with the idea that we don't want to mess around too much with our hormonal balances, and particularly messing around with estrogens and testosterone can cause predisposition to prostate and breast cancers. But we also know there's a pretty interesting link with bladder cancer, and a lot of investigators in our community are studying that, including Max and Carol Lombardo, whom I just ran into upstairs, running experiments on that yesterday. So yeah, and then the other thing is this AH receptor, which was kind of in the footnote of one of your talks. That's actually a receptor that I studied as a graduate student because it binds dioxin, and it also interacts with a lot of environmental chemicals. It's interesting. Noah and Jeannie are actually doing a clinical trial evaluating the effects of an AH receptor antagonist in patients with advanced bladder cancer. And the preclinical data show that the AH receptor is really important in preclinical models of bladder cancer. So that's also a molecular target for us to pay attention to with respect to environmental contaminants. So I'm going to stop monopolizing the conversation, turn over to Stephanie Chisholm, who I think everybody knows is one of our close colleagues at Beacon. And she's asking us, what can you tell us about DHEP use in soft catheters and bladder cancer?
Yeah, so catheters association with bladder cancer. So the most significant or the most well-known studied is chronic indwelling catheters and squamous cell carcinoma of the bladder. And we know that the kind of the carcinogenesis or the pathway to developing a tumor for those, at least for chronic indwelling catheters, is really this irritation or inflammatory state, which transitions the bladder cells from a pro-inflammatory state to the squamous change, and then ends up changing to squamous cell carcinoma. And the soft catheters as well, we don't know if that's the exact, if there is an exact mechanism or not. We've hypothesized with we've had this conversation too with our PhD chemists, and we've done leaching experiments. And so we've actually taken silicone catheters as well as latex catheters which obviously have their own components, and we've leached them in normal urine to see if catheters sitting in the bladder, not necessarily touching the bladder, but just sitting in urine, does that leach kind of the components or break down the catheters, and does that cause some sort of effect? And we really didn't see much leaching or kind of degradation of these catheters. So it's another area that we really are unclear in terms of if there's any association or not.
Right, and it's interesting to consider maybe the interaction between some of the plastic contaminants and irritation or inflammation that might be caused by physical trauma, right? So I think this is a really important area of research, and you're actively studying it right now, which is great. So Karen Saxo, who is also a very familiar name to us, says, do all plastics contain these toxins?
Yes and no. So it depends on what type of plastic. And so that's the whole, when you look at recycling and you see all these numbers associated with plastic, et cetera, it kind of gives you a leeway or insight into how that item was made and really the background of their components. And so if you take a plastic container such as a Tupperware, that you take for lunch. Most of those are BPA free. And because they're rigid, but they're also not, BPA is really used to make the plastic malleable, and most of those are not. If you take, and then on the other hand, if you take a Poland or spring water bottle or any other spring light kind of flimsy water bottle, those tend to have BPA in them. And so not all plastics are composed of the same, are made up of the same kind of components. However, if you think about it, BPA is the most commonly used, but PVCs are here's PVC piping, and that's probably one of the biggest components of our irrigation systems and other kind of water kind of transport mechanisms. But not all plastics have these components.
Thanks. And I guess this is also related to Kathleen Hahn's question. Is there code on plastic that tells you it's BPA free?
That is a great question. Most companies and most bottles usually do give you a warning saying this is BPA free. So most people and most companies will kind of advertise that. I apologize for not knowing that. I do not believe that though there's an actual code on a bottle that actually states if it's BPA free. I think it's usually just they have to explicitly say BPA free, but most of the times they are. However, what I've learned in the last several years from my research is that BPA is associated with this kind of carbon backbone, and what companies have been doing are they're changing it so it's actually not BPA, and it's actually now BPC or BPD, and they're just changing the molecule around so they don't have to actually say if it contains BPA. So what they did is the EPA and FDA really said that companies need to state if there is BPA in it or not, but now they're getting away by it by using different molecules that are doing the same thing. So now we don't even know. We have to investigate these newer components or similar components of BPA to really investigate those too. So they're working around it, which is making our lives a little bit difficult.
Understood. And this is familiar with the environmental contaminants that have been historically a real problem with industry, making sure that these measurements that you're doing are done, because you have to be objective, right? Double check everybody.
Yeah.
So an anonymous person said, with regard to secondhand smoke, how long after the exposure is there still a risk?
That's another great question. So what I historically tell patients, even if they're a smoker themselves, the day you stop smoking, you're going to see the benefit. Your body's going to see a benefit. So I would extrapolate to secondhand smoking as well. And the real reason for that is almost like how I kind of discussed about obesity and diabetes with a slight link to increased cancers. It's this inflammatory state. If you decrease your exposure to smoking, whether that's today or 10 days from now, your body's going to notice that difference. And so there's always a decreased risk. So I tell every patient who smokes, if they come into my clinic saying, hey, I got a new diagnosis of bladder cancer or kidney cancer, it's like, what's the most likely cause? I'm like, are you a smoker? Yes or no? I'm like, well, from the limited data we know, if it's not a familial or genetic thing that we know, then it's most likely your exposure to smoking. But if you stop smoking right now, your body's going to decrease its future risk. And so if you can decrease your risk as early as possible, that's the best thing you can do.
So yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And I think furthermore, Otis Brawley shared the same opinion with us on a previous one of these. I also think that it's important that we think about actually measuring the benefit at some point as part of our Precision Medicine Center of Excellence. So if one of your patients or one of our stakeholders in the audience decided to adopt a dietary plan that should decrease inflammation, I would hope that we would be able to measure that as part of the experiment and actually publish results on the effects. I think that's a really important subject of further research.
And that's what we're actually doing. We've actually teamed up with a medical student who this is another area I'm very interested in terms of how we can benefit our own health in terms of cancer. And I kind of learned a little bit of this from one of my old mentors and who trained me, Dr. John Kellogg Parsons at UC San Diego. He actually was a resident here at Johns Hopkins, is at UC San Diego now, works and is works for Janssen Pharmaceuticals. However, he had that whole diet study in prostate cancer, and I've always wanted to know, if is high intensity interval workout or certain diets can we help, especially for bladder cancer and kidney cancers? Are there associations to that, and we can measure that? So we're actually creating a kind of a paradigm, or kind of a model. We're teaming with Dr. Singla here as well, and Dr. Yasser Ged, to look at that for kidney cancer, but extrapolating that to bladder cancer as well.
Fantastic. So Linda asks, bladder cancer patients get regular CTs with contrast. How damaging is this to our kidneys?
So if kidneys are functioning completely normal, then contrast loads are not damaging to the kidneys. So the kidneys just need to filter. As long as you're staying hydrated and your kidney functions great, repeated contrast loads are not damaging to your kidneys. That is from what we know. However, if you have baseline kidney disease, the contrast load can be a little bit more difficult for your kidney to filter, and that can cause a little bit of damage to it, and that's called an acute damage. And your kidneys do recover, but that's what you see sometimes if the kidney function tests go up a little bit, but they do recover from that. But as long as you have normal kidneys, you don't develop this acute damage, which is not harmful. And nowadays too, a follow-up just to add to that, and maybe a follow-up question, is the whole radiation situation. And nowadays we're very good with our imaging modalities and decreasing our radiation, and our radiologists and our technicians are decreasing the actual exposure of radiation per scan that they need. And so everyone's really aware of that. And so I think that we've come a long way in terms of medicine, in terms of being cognizant of exposure to radiation and imaging.
So Stephanie Greenberg has a few questions for you too, while others are thinking about theirs. So from a science standpoint, how can one be sure that certain toxicants or chemicals cause cancer? And in this case, bladder cancer.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. And I thought a lot about this, and what we really need to do is get down into, so we've all the data that we have right now is associations, and this kind of patient has cancer, we look at them and they're like, oh, they have BPA in their urine, so what? And another thing that Dr. McConkie and I were actually discussing the other day is this whole exposure. Is this a concentration issue too? Is we may be all exposed to all of this, and it may not ever cause cancer because we're exposed to this kind of baseline level or concentration, but it may only cause cancer if we get to a certain level or concentration of exposure, such as like radiation that we've kind of understood. We're all exposed to radiation, whether it's a flight, standing outside, but we're not all getting cancers. But we know patients or people who are exposed to high doses of radiation develop tumors. So similar concept. And the way to really understand this, we need to get down to the kind of nitty-gritty details and look at actual pathways of these toxins. What Dr. McConkie alluded to is looking at these receptors that we're finding this associations to, or potential in other malignancies, and kind of utilizing the knowledge that we have for other cancers, such as breast, liver, and stomach cancers, which arguably are probably in colon cancer, which arguably are the four most common cancers that have had the most studies done for exposures, and extrapolating that to us, and setting up animal models or organoids and looking at exposure at different concentrations if we were seeing a change. And then we look at the exact change of the mechanism. And then if we can find that out, then we potentially have a way to target, like, oh, we can use an H antagonist to stop this conversion.
Exactly.
That is the goal of mine, and I think the goal of Dr. McConkie too now that is our goal in the foreseeable future here, is to really study that and become hopefully the experts in this field, however it unfolds. Hopefully we can have this conversation, say this does not cause cancer, and at least we can tell you that, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, so the story about dioxin is actually relevant to this. So if you give a young rat a very, very minute amount of dioxin, you will cause that rat to die. But then subsequently, there have been a lot of human exposures that haven't caused that same acute toxicity. I'm not saying dioxin is harmless, but sometimes the translation between our rodent models and human beings is imperfect. So I think that the way you're doing this by measuring things in people first, and then performing mechanistic studies in laboratory models is really the way to go. And I also really underscore the importance of identifying mechanisms. So Kathleen Hahn has a follow-up, which is, why can't they flush the kidneys with IV after the contrast?
So in patients that have suspected kidney disease, that's exactly what they do. And they do give you IV fluids, but in someone such as if I've gone a CT scan, I have no known kidney disease, my kidneys don't need that extra fluid to flush it out, so to speak. But you're exactly right. They do give IV fluids for patients who have suspected kidney disease or borderline where they would be potentially worried about it.
Yeah. I forgot to mention one more thing, kind of back to the subject of dose response, which if you're a toxicologist, that's kind of the first thing they teach you to think about is dose response. It's also how long the thing stays in your body. So another problem with dioxins, and certainly it could be possible with a lot of these plastic chemicals, is that they stick around for a long time in your body. So it's not just the exposure that you have on Tuesday, but it can also be the cumulative exposure you have over the course of your lifetime. So again, measuring this stuff in people and patient tissues is another important part of what Dr. Patel is going to do, I think, during his career. So Karen Saxa has another follow-up question, which is there an association with genetic mutations and toxicants?
Say that again, you cut out for a second.
Sorry, is there an association between genetic mutations and toxins?
To the best of my knowledge, no. And I think Dr. McConkey probably can answer that better than me, but I don't believe that there is, in terms of, because most of the genetic mutations we're seeing are things that are passed down from our parents and our family and our lineage. With these somatic mutations, our environmental toxins potentially can cause mutations, but not ones that are passed down. And that whole 1-2 hit kind of conversation. You're not born unless you're born with one hit and then you get another one. But to the best of my knowledge, we don't know enough about our environmental toxins causing mutations which cause cancer.
Right. I think Dr. Patel is speaking about cancer predisposition syndromes, but certainly we looked for a long time for certain mutations that might be caused by cigarette smoke exposure. And whereas we can find those very easily in the lung, because maybe it's direct exposure to these chemicals in the lung, we had a hard time finding them in the bladder. But now we're starting to see things going on with the patterns of mutations that look like they're linked to cigarette smoking indirectly. Likewise, there's a chemical called aristolochic acid that has been linked to upper tract cancers that causes a very specific signature of mutations. And we find that those signatures are present not just in people with upper tract cancers in the Middle East and in Asia, but also in people who are taking certain Asian herbal remedies. Finally, there is very, very early data suggesting there might be signatures associated with alcohol exposure. There was a recent paper from another Asian group published in the journal Cancer Cell, which linked certain signatures to exposure to alcohol that was also exacerbated by having certain genetic problems with alcohol metabolism. So overall, very compelling story, but also very preliminary. We don't have those same links with dioxins or the plastic contaminants that we've been talking about today, or arsenic or cadmium or some of the other exposures many of you may have heard about, solvents. And that is absolutely a high priority for research. Maybe what we should do is look very carefully at exposures and try to correlate those exposures to certain patterns of mutation across genes in patient cancers to see if we can discover new patterns that haven't been discovered before, because that's kind of the way things have been emerging with some of these other exposures: cigarette smoke, alcohol, and aristolochic acid. So good question. So again, in the Q&A, Karen Godfrey says, for those with neo or IP pouches, are there any studies in our cytology tests of possible changes to the colon or intestinal tissue caused by our urine that might have those chemicals present?
As of right now, no. And I think IP mean ileal conduits, but our urinary diversions, the tests that we're seeing, or the cytologies, are really just looking for any changes for the urothelial cells or sloughing off of high-grade urothelial cells from the kidneys or the renal pelvis down into the conduit. And that's what we're really looking for those cytology exams. It's a way to monitor the rest of the urothelial lining that's still present in patients who've had a cystectomy. But to the best of my knowledge, none of those tests are identifying that. And it's one of those, those studies or area of focus and research that we need to look at is, are we seeing any toxins in those as well? And does that change risk or anything like that? Since now you think about it, if you have someone who's having exposed to some exposure or some toxin, they develop bladder cancer because of a toxin, say we've later figured that out and it's coming through the urine. Now are we exposing our conduits or our reservoirs, neobladders, ileal conduits, to that same risk? And so that's a great question, but nothing that we know right now.
It's a great question. I can imagine that things might be different metabolically, but I don't know of anybody who's actually measured those changes. So Mary Grace Phelan says, I know cannabis and tobacco smoke are very different, but are there any specific bad signatures in bladder cancer or others from smoking marijuana?
Not that I know of. That's a great question.
Yeah. Mary Grace, it's early days. So these kinds of epidemiologic links take decades to establish. So I think we'll be seeing that at some point in your lifetime, but we don't know the answer right now. So another person has asked, can asbestos cause bladder cancer?
So asbestos has been linked with mesothelioma, as we've probably all seen on the television a long time ago. But to the best of my knowledge, I'm not seeing, it's not a question that I ask routinely in my patients, but we're not seeing it linked with bladder cancer.
So right, and we really don't know how the bladder urothelium, we call it, would be exposed to asbestos, because it's really a particulate that causes damage to the lung. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but we need to figure out how it would get to the bladder, and in order to understand how it might affect the bladder. Could also, I guess, have systemic effects caused by the damage it's doing to the lung that could indirectly cause inflammation that might promote bladder cancer. So I think Randy Hall has raised a hand, might want to ask a question live. I'm not sure we have the ability to do that. Randy, can you put your question in the chat?
While we're doing that, kind of just to follow up with that, the whole asbestos and mesothelioma and lung exposure, it's kind of what we're seeing too, and Dr. McConkey alluded to this, is these toxins and what we know about the established toxins. So everyone's probably aware of excessive charred or grilled meat linked to gastric or stomach cancer. Again, it's this direct exposure. So for us, from a urologic standpoint, it's very interesting because our organs are a little bit protected because a lot of these things are either ingested or inhaled. So the stomach or the lung or the colonic kind of lining is really going to be the first passerbys. And then that sets up what's the next kind of barrier. And that's what we also see liver issues too, especially with BPAs. And to just touch back on BPA, what we know so far, if it gets ingested, it's active, but we think that the liver actually deactivates it and detoxifies it. However, the kidneys have to filter. So we don't know if there's a level there or a component of BPA is cytotoxic. And so that's like I said, for the urologic malignancies, it's very interesting because we're not getting a lot of direct exposures. What we're seeing, obviously, what we know for bladder cancers and chronic catheters or schistosomiasis, those are direct irritation we know that that's the inflammatory state causing the change. But the kidneys and the rest of the lining or the prostate, we're not seeing much. And to the best of my knowledge too, I don't know if there's any association with chronic prostatitis and prostate cancer. And so it's very interesting. And so that's another area, another thing that I constantly think about is how to best study this. And so that it's a great kind of question. And again, that's something that's constantly on my mind too, is how am I really going to investigate this?
Yeah, I think where Dr. Patel and his colleagues have started is really the most logical place to start, which is to measure stuff. And hopefully you measure stuff in a way that's very objective. We have methods now that allow us to essentially see all chemicals of a given class in a particular substance. And so we need to know what's in people before we know what to study. And so the focus that he has on catheters and other plastic exposures is really, I think, very appropriate, measuring the stuff that they leach into fluids, including urine. So Randy's written this question in the chat, which is, I thought there were some studies that showed high THC causing testicular cancer in young men who are heavy smokers. Are you aware?
No, I think so. I think that was study. There was a study done in 2015, and it was there was a very few patients in that study, and I don't think it was almost like a retrospective analysis. I don't think it was an actual basic science paper, and it's just causality. And I don't think they found an exact mechanism. I think they found an increased association, but I don't think they found a causality of it. So I think that's another area that needs to be studied. And like Dr. McConkie alluded to, the whole marijuana smoking and lung cancer, we just don't have enough data for years to really kind of assess that. But I don't know of any actual mechanism that they proposed in that. I think from what I know is that they found an increased association, but not an actual cause.
Right, and that's an important point. So again, there is a tendency for us to see potential associations and get very worried about them. But overall, it's very important when you're looking at this kind of work to ask yourself, how many people were they studying, and how long were they studying them, and how many other groups are doing the same kinds of studies and showing the same kinds of results? In other words, how reproducible are the observations? And so because marijuana has really just become a lot more widespread over the last decade, I think you're going to see a lot higher quality work coming out about what the exposures might be linked to than we've had available in the past, especially as people are more comfortable talking about their use. So I think, again, patients should advocate for more research in this area. And hopefully, again, we will find out that the marijuana smoking isn't as bad as cigarette smoking, but because it's a new exposure that our bodies have not been used to, there is definitely the potential for some toxins to be present there. So, and then Karen Saxa has, many vegetables come in plastic bags that are microwavable. Do these bags contain toxins?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't know that. Well, we presume they can contain components of plastic that may, if they break down, may be toxic to you. However, the bag itself is not toxic. And that's the key component, I think, about all of these plastics that we have. So a plastic bottle that you touch, a plastic bag that's used to put your groceries in, or that's stored in the freezer for these frozen microwaves, and it's like a microwave steam bag. We know that those aren't detrimental. I don't think that what people have not studied, and this is something about which we're learning too in environmental kind of studies, such as UV radiation breaking down components of plastic to even smaller products, which potentially may be dangerous. I don't think anyone's actually looked at what happens when you use the microwave to break down or put that bag in there to see if it breaks anything down. But we know, as of right now, we don't think that there is anything in there, because most of these bags and kind of storaging have to go through some sort of regulatory thing through the FDA, and so those usually go through pretty stringent stuff. So we don't know. I don't think that that's causal, or there's anything in there that's toxic directly to you.
I agree. I think that's really important. We don't have any reason to think that there are toxins in there. I think, again, you kind of have to design your experiment to look for something. And a lot of the times what we think we should look for isn't exactly what we should be looking for. So it's definitely possible that we're exposed to things that are dangerous that we don't know are dangerous right now. But I don't think changing all of your habits is warranted by the available data right now, especially around plastic. I guess if you're concerned about it, it doesn't hurt not to put plastic in the microwave. So Linda says, can you talk about the use of hair dyes by women?
Yes, and I wish Dr. Carson Prassi was here. So we're finding there are a lot. So people who work at hair salons, specifically, and this is a study that we did with Carson Prassi here, where he was the lead and kind of helped, or we've kind of helped on him a little bit. But looking at actually the urine samples from women and men who work in these hair salons or are constantly exposed to these aerosolized components of hairspray, hair dyes, etc. They're finding very high amounts of them in their urine. We don't know, though, key thing is we just know that there are elevated levels of them in the patient's body and in their urine, but we don't know if there actually is an actual detriment or downstream effect of them. And I think that's a lot to do with, and it kind of seems like the theme of this topic, but I reiterate that's why I think this topic is so interesting. We're stuck right now we're learning so much about these exposures, and we're learning more about toxins and byproducts and how potentially can affect us, but we're all at this level of there may be association, but we don't know if it's actually causing anything. And that's where our team is really trying to make that just discern, is it actually causing problems or not, so we can help answer these questions and get to the bottom of this, I think. But the hair dye thing is very interesting. And I actually did not know about this until a year and a half ago. And this is one of my colleagues here is the one who really talked to me about that and kind of opened up my eyes to it. And then if you think about it more, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that we're not exposed to one toxicant in isolation. So we also have to worry about what's in the environments around us, air pollution, what's in the water, what's in the soil. So and cancer takes a long time to develop. So it's not as though you can measure something and expect to immediately see the consequences of an exposure. So again, this takes hard work and a lot of research, and I'm glad that Dr. Patel is focusing on this. So Kathleen Hahn has a question: is organic food really less toxic?
Organic food is less toxic in the kind of sense that it has not had pesticides, or which are really the key component of the biggest known toxins, organophosphates. And organophosphates, I can tell you that the organophosphates do have some good data supporting its cytotoxic effect or danger to us. I think the best is really clearly studied in testis cancer patients. And it's also, organophosphates are detrimental in women who are pregnant, and it can cause issues with birth defects. However, so I think that's the only kind of knowledge we know about organic food and safe or not. But besides that, though, if you're having non-organic food or pesticides that are organophosphate free, I guess it's relatively similar. But then I think that's why when we go to grocery stores, the biggest thing is wash your groceries. And if you get rid of those, if there are pesticides on your food, then I don't think that there's any major difference in terms of your exposure or not. But that would be my only take on that.
Right, I agree. I think a lot of people worry about so-called dirty dozen fruits and vegetables. And again, I think if you're just careful about washing, I personally buy a lot of organic food because I just think it can't hurt. It costs more money, but if you wash your food carefully and you try not to source it from strange places where they might be using more pesticides than others, I think your risk of being damaged by what you're eating, especially if it's fresh fruits and vegetables, is pretty low. So Ann Hoffman asks, what about saran wrap?
Best of my knowledge, saran wrap is not toxic that we've known, or any kind of association or risk of any cancers associated with that.
And Adrinette asks, does diet soda cause bladder cancer?
No, that's nothing. Again, I don't think that's clearly been studied, but I know this whole concept of diet sodas having artificial sweeteners, such as kind of sweet and low, etc. And are those cancer-causing agents? And I don't think that we have data to support that they actually are cancer-causing agents. I think my take on this is, I almost like kind of what Dr. McConkey said too for the organic food is, I don't think it hurts to avoid diet sodas if you can. I think everything in this situation, in these kind of situations where we don't know, there's not like smoking clearly causes cancer. We know that for these, that we know that diet soda has been around for years and it hasn't clearly been linked to high volumes of cancer. I don't think it's harmful if that's something that makes you happy if you do it once. If you have a diet soda here and there, I don't think it's soda here and there is going to cause cancer. But like I said, I don't think that's been thoroughly studied. And it goes back to the topic or a conversation I have with my patients all the time, specifically regarding alcohol and diet. And I always tell my patients, try to live your life in moderation. If you're gonna have a glass of wine, have one glass of wine instead of 5. If you're gonna have a steak, make it once in a while. Don't have it every day. Don't take away the pleasures in life, but just think about, you can always be conscientious of things. I think the same thing goes with diet sodas. I don't think it's harmful for you right now. And I think you should enjoy if that's what brings you happy or brings you joy. But I don't think that you should be worried that's going to cause cancer right now. I don't think we have any data to support that.
Totally agree. I think again, if your choice is between a diet soda and a full octane sugar soda, there are strengths and weaknesses associated with each, and dose response, again, very important to remember. It's how much you're exposed to, not just what you're exposed to. So T. Lowe asks, any thoughts on toxins and bladder tumor recurrences? Certain exposures lessening the efficacy of bladder cancer treatments?
That's a great question. And kind of, I guess that alludes to a little bit what I talked about with BPAs and concern for its estrogen effects and its detrimental effect in theory in men who are undergoing androgen deprivation therapy. So I guess you can kind of extrapolate that kind of hypothesis for bladder cancer. Again, I would love to tell you that we know the answer to that. And hopefully that's something that we have an answer to in the foreseeable future, if that is truly harmful or not. But that's another area. I think the first step is figuring out if there's an association with anything in bladder cancers. And then I think we go down that path is saying, okay, does it cause this? Yes or no? If it does this exposure, or if not, does this exposure damage or harm people who already have known cancer? And I think that's a great study to do. And I think that's something that we need to learn, something we just don't have an answer to.
So Kathleen Hahn asks, do you need animal protein to repair DNA?
No, you don't need animal protein to repair DNA whatsoever. There's a lot of people who are vegans, vegetarians who don't consume any animal products, who have normal, healthy lifestyles, who have enough ability to repair their own DNA. And that's really not necessary to need animal kind of protein to eat or to have that.
I agree. I haven't seen any evidence that animal protein is better than vegetable protein at doing what protein does. So, so we're close to the top of the hour. I might ask one more question, but first I want to make sure that our audience has the opportunity to ask one more question if you have one. Okay, so Dr. Patel, what do you think the most important things we could do to minimize our risk of being exposed to things in the environment that might either cause bladder cancer in people that don't have it already, or might make bladder cancer worse in people who do? What would you do if you were a person worried about environmental toxins and bladder cancer?
Yeah, so kind of getting back to almost my last slide, I think, in my talk, in my slide deck, was really, one is understand that we don't know enough about this to really kind of get up in arms, I think, about this. I wouldn't go drastically change your lifestyle per se, but I would make conscientious decisions if that's something that's a big concern. And that's something I've done as well. Minimizing your need for plastic-based kind of materials or items, buying fresh groceries rather than packaged items that are unnecessary, using this reusable plastic containers, or even bringing them to restaurants. You don't have to constantly get them packaged. So I think decreasing that will help decrease our constant exposure. And kind of like that slide I showed, if we consume so much plastic, we're going to constantly have it around us. So I think that's one thing. Two is limiting your exposure to stuff that are known carcinogens. Smoking, we know that that's one of the biggest things we can avoid. And so I think if we can do that, you can decrease your personal risk. And I think lastly is being patient advocates and pushing the envelope for kind of scientific research. I think that's another big thing, is especially in this field. I think if we have more resources for this, this is almost not only, especially just for bladder cancer patients, this is almost like a global or public health kind of entity. And I think we can make a big difference. But I think the best thing to do is just live your life without fear, but also being conscientious that there may be some things that we are doing right now that we just don't know, or living amongst things that we don't know that are detrimental to us, and only time will tell through research. And I think don't get too crazy and listening to everything that's out there in the media, because we do see a lot of things. And remember, the biggest thing is, I think Dr. McConkie said this really well, is you see something, it doesn't mean it causes it. And so I think that's one thing that we always get kind of wrapped in. It's like, oh, they found, even such as myself, my own study, BPA was elevated in the bladder cancer group. There may be something there. There may not be. We don't think it caused it, but that's something to just kind of be kind of thoughtful about.
Thanks, Sunil. It's been a pleasure listening to you today. I am so excited that you joined our team, and I am positive you're going to do great things in this area, and look forward to those great things. Fantastic talk.
No, thank you very much for having me speak. Clearly you can tell I'm very passionate about this. It's something that's very high interest to me. And then hopefully in future talks, we have more data, more answers. So some of your great questions. I appreciate everyone's very insightful kind of interaction in this as well.
Take care, everybody. And reach out to us if you have any questions that develop after this is over. Take care.
Take care, everyone.